Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today's topic, I'll be talking about the Steam release of Dead Estate, an action roguelite by the Milkbar Lads, and an ultimately more fleshed out rendition of the initial Newgrounds release. That said, as I sift through its story, mull on its mechanics, and poke at its presentation, we'll get to discover whether this estate was in dire need of foreclosure, or an absolutely deadly delight. I'm your host Arlyeon. Let's find out together. Running someone over is normally a harrowing enough experience, but when the victim gets back up and then chases you into a zombie-infested manor, you know you're in for a bad time. Still, that animated intro does a pretty good job of letting you know what you're getting into. It's also the only storytelling that's initially offered beyond an arcade-esque ending that's more or less shared between the various characters. Sure, there's some flavor text when you pick up items as different characters or scroll over shop items, but Dead Estate keeps things simple. That is, until you gain access to the witch/shopkeeper Cordelia. Not only does she stand out for having a unique ending that fleshes out the story as a whole, completing a run as Cordelia also grants players the means of pursuing the game's true ending route. On that front, the true ending does feel a bit more satisfying, as while it's shared for all characters, there's a little something for the entire cast. Just, set a couple minutes aside for it, since you can't skip or fast forward to the true ending, which can definitely bog down your attempts to binge the game on repeat playthroughs. And, I did binge it, given that it scratches a certain itch for me. See, Dead Estate's an action-oriented roguelite with a fairly simple premise. Make your way through the mansion, beating up its undead denizens in a series of arena-esque rooms until you can find the key to the boss. Cue epic battle, then rinse and repeat till you get to the final floor. That said, there's a few things that complicate this. For one thing, while I called this a roguelite, that's more because of the inherent randomization of the map layout, the resources available to you, and the fact that it's less than traditional. That said, unlike many of its lighter peers, it expressly omits any form of meta progression, so the game never gets objectively easier. Which means it behooves players to master the basics of running, gunning, and the occasional bunny hop. Honestly, I found the latter to be a bit fiddly as far as defensive maneuvers go, if only because without stacking jump height, I'd frequently find myself clipping an enemy when I tried to vault over them. It behooved me to get very familiar with all of the enemies, obstacles, and bosses unique to each of the game's normal and optional floors, just so I couldn't be caught unaware by a sudden splurge of damage. Special shout out to optional floor 3 for being absolutely hellish when you first get there, but fairly relaxed once you actually understand how it works. That said, there's something to be said for growing more comfortable with the characters themselves. Each one is distinct, and even the initial pair of Jeff and Jules provide a different playstyle, courtesy of Jeff being slow but sturdy, and Jules being a fragile speedster whose default shotgun requires her to get up close and personal and then dart out again. And as you unlock further characters, these differences become a lot more pronounced. As Fuji, for instance, can't use any secondary weapons scattered about the mansion, yet not only are her fists more than up to the task, she also gets a unique air dash that lets her safely get around, though she can't use it out of combat. There's also Lydia, who starts out with a hefty hunk of cash, finds more than the other characters, and even gets free items from finding money. The only problem is she may as well be time is money incarnate, given she bleeds out cash as the seconds tick by, as well as whenever she takes damage. It's these distinctions which made the process of acquiring all 8 characters a worthwhile endeavor. It really does behoove you to get comfortable with how they play, given meat chunks. This mutated rat serves as a time limit of sorts, dogging your steps if you dally on a floor for too long. Not only is he beefy enough that it takes a sustained assault to bring him to heel, he's also capable of some surprising speed since it's tied to yours. That's right, while he's fairly manageable on slower characters, if you boost your speed up, he'll zip through a room on his way towards you, and yeah, this guy's persistent enough to give the nemesis a run for his money. He'll even barge into rooms you're actively fighting in to make things a bigger mess, though he does move slower while other enemies are around and leaves the way he entered open. Thing is, though, even without ramping difficulties shortening his spawn timer, I still pretty much saw him on every floor unless I was sticking around on easy. Part of it's just greed, no doubt. If you can successfully take him down, he's worth quite a bit of currency, and given he's able to be taken down on every floor except for the third secret stage, that can contribute a lot to a winning run. That said, it also boils down to me just being a vulture and scavenging each floor for every resource it has, such as the treasure room on each floor, which provides items with rad modifiers like stat boosts, giving you a chance to ignite things on hit, or ridiculous things like locking your health at 1 and quadrupling your DPS, or making fart sounds when you shoot. Okay, not all game changers are equal, but even the joke items can suddenly become useful if you get the item that rerolls your entire inventory. And you can double up on these freebies if you're willing to check out challenge rooms, which task you with clearing out a set of enemy waves within 40 seconds for 1 or 2 items. Unless you fail, in which case you get Bupkis Buster. And the item stacking doesn't end there, given that normal floors also have an item shop for you to splurge your currency in. Sure, it's expensive, but it provides a lot of options to build towards neat synergies. For instance, add an item that allows you to destroy a secondary weapon for extra currency, one that cranks the damage the more cash you have, and one that gives you max health for every full ammo weapon you break. Maybe an item that gives you 2 weapon chests whenever you enter a weapon room. All of a sudden, you're the juggernaut and becomes a viable strategy to recycle every weapon you find, to the point that I'd even stroll over to the gun vendor whenever they cropped up in order to buy out their inventory one at a time and break them, since you can only hold 1 secondary weapon at a time by default. Though I do have a bad habit of shattering weapons even without that combo. There's some very rad weapons out there that can really change things around in a pinch, such as the error gun or unique ones Cordelia gets, like her ice staff, but I'm very greedy for money. Partly because I'm splurging on the run-specific stat boost provided by the doctor's office, but mostly because of how fundamental role currency factors into the game's difficulty. See, once you clear normal, you gain access to the next difficulty level, ultimately culminating in the must-die difficulty. Each one slowly amps up the durability, speed, and attack rate of the enemies, as well as reducing the spawn time for chunks till it's instant in the final one. It also nerfs the map in must-die, so good luck seeing where you are. That said, the largest change between each one of these difficulties is the economy of cash and corazon. I hope I said that right, but you know, the hearts. Yeah, healing gets rough, since the random hearts that spawn from enemies in pots become practically extinct without items, and while enemies only do 1 damage, the protagonist's low max health greatly disincentivizes sloppiness, especially since the full heal items cost a pretty penny. And the severity of this fiscal fiasco only intensifies when you realize that dead enemies don't drop dollops of dosh anymore. They were so broke, I felt a weird kinship even as I was left perpetually scrounging their remains for resources. In fact, in the final difficulty, it's practically required to be able to find the secret rooms scattered in the various levels just to make ends meet. Oh, and those rare hearts, they're potentially worth more to you at full health, given they convert into cash that you're likely hurting for. It's a rough enough escalation that even when you do a looped run, which is where you choose to ignore the last boss and throw yourself back at the start of the game, albeit at a higher difficulty, even that is a fairly rough experience, especially when you factor in the gross inflation that shop prices suffer from in loops. All of this factors into why I perpetually throw myself at the optional stages, even when I have no intention of tackling the very final boss. Like, yes, they're notably harder than their vanilla variants and lack vendors, and thus fast access to full heals, but they're a decent source of chests and coins, which can just prove pivotal in turning around a struggling run. Or not. My tragic failings aside, though, it's time to talk about graphics, and there is so much here I like. For one thing, the overall sprite work for the levels and enemies are a lot of fun. That said, I think what really got me was the character portraits, whether it was the default characters, their meme unlockable costume variants, and yes, the shopkeeper's portraits. Honestly, this one was probably the most noteworthy for me for 2 reasons. Eyes up, Buster. While her portraits as a doctor and gun merchant stay the same, her item shop portrait changes every floor, which is pretty rad, and factors in the rooftops rain, which is probably my favorite portrait. That said, when you play as Cordelia, it's her mom that's the shopkeeper, and it still changes every floor and has unique dock and weapons vendor art, which I just love that a lot. Also, both the opening and ending sequences are pretty nifty, and I enjoyed a lot of the references in the end credits for the true ending. Beyond that, I appreciated the sound design as well. It's neat that all the characters have their own distinct voice clips when they take damage, and there's some neat greetings from the shopkeeper. The music's a lot of fun as well, though on a purely sound effects level, I may have tweaked the sound effects for bullets down, if only because my finger was permanently holding down the shoot button, and boy does that get old as you crank your rate of fire. Anyways, it's time to make my closing statement, so here goes. I'm quite fond of the game. 30 hours in, and I'm still not quite done with it type font. Sure, there wasn't a lot to unravel on a narrative front, but I took a lot of enjoyment out of mastering the fundamentals of the game itself, as well as the unique hurdles of the various characters. Especially when I started pursuing some of the unique achievements, like getting through a run as Lydia without breaking a single pot, which meant significantly less monies and heals on a character that thrives on money to unlock her costume. Or a looped run as Lewis without ever picking up a heart. These were hefty challenges, and those costumes that I earned from them felt like legitimate rewards. That said, as I continued to loop through the game, I began to have some gripes, and more than just because the end credits are unskippable during the true ending, though boy, that got old. For one thing, while there's at least a tiny boss pool for the first 2 normal stages, that's the extent of the randomization on that front, so you'll get very familiar with the rest of the big bad ensemble. For another, jump shooting is a pain in the butt. Honestly, I just hate bunny hopping at enemies. Will sometimes float up higher than I can shoot at them. It's tedious as fuck, and if I shoot them and knock them up higher somehow, I'm even saltier. Lastly, there's Digby. Honestly, he is a pretty awesome character, a kid unable to use guns, but who makes do with a bat, some decent stats, and an altogether unique trait. See, he can combo kills together, and the more he does this, the faster he moves and attacks, and it just keeps scaling. I actually got it to 64 once, and I was just zipping through rooms at this lunatic pace. And it heals you if you let it run out with a high enough combo, which is going to happen since the boss's spawn animation will last longer than your combo bar. It's a little depressing. I mean, while unfortunate, I imagine this is to prevent you from melting bosses, and I'm a little sad about that, but no. My gripe hinges on Digby and the way he interacts with Chunks. Specifically, how his speed works. See, he becomes a legitimate issue when you realize that not only is Chunks getting speed modifiers from difficulty and from Digby's base speed, he's also getting your combo bonus. Yeah, he can just do a killer Speedy Gonzalez impression, slamming into you with nigh unavoidable damage. It's also why the item Sugar is a trap. That's all I have to say. But here's the thing, while I may have these gripes, they come from a place of affection, because I enjoy this game so much, because I've dived in time and time again, trying out these various tactics in order to reach the end. And ultimately, that's why, even with these quibbles, I have to solidly recommend Dead Estate as a hit, and one I'm going to be keeping my eye on for some time, given that I know there's some more content in the works for it, and you folks may hear more about that next week. So, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find my link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. There's also a Patreon, so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. And lastly, if you just want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.